Hello, and welcome to episode 00024 of the 10,000 Heroes podcast, slowly going from 0 to 10,000, 1 hour, one episode at a time. I'm Ankur Shah Delight, and today's interview is with Kern Beare. I met Kern in the summer of 2020 after seeing a talk posted on the Awakin list, and I was just immediately impressed by his project, a drive across the country talking to people of radically different political perspectives and ideologies, searching for the seeds of common understanding at a time where our country seemed so divided. It's really my kind of a dream project. I wish I did it. It's the same feeling I had when I saw Michael Ferranti going to Iraq with a guitar. It's just like, I wish I could do that. I'm so glad these people are doing it. The potential for human creativity and curiosity to overcome the spectacle of division is how I see it. And in today's episode, I catch up with Kern on how that journey went, where it's taken him, what he learned, what he thinks can save America from discord, and much more. So thanks again for listening to today's show. Stay tuned after the interview for the debrief with my co-host, Nathan Ramos. And please get in touch with us. You can email us at info@10kh.show or follow us on Twitter at 10khshow. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kern Beare to the show. So let's just start with that. How did that project of driving across the country and having those conversations, how did that begin?
Well, I think the election of Donald Trump in 2016 probably sparked so many different kinds of initiatives, so many different kinds of responses among people who were surprised by that outcome. And everybody that I know was really, I would say, in a state of shock. And my response to it was the same. I was so caught off guard by his election. And I think what really struck me was the fact that I was caught off guard. Like, why wasn't I aware that there was some sort of shift that had happened in this country that would have made that possible? And so the overwhelming feeling was just being trapped in a bubble. And, I live in Silicon Valley, and I think wherever we live is a bubble, but I think Silicon Valley is a particularly potent bubble to be in. And I felt just sort of viscerally constrained by it. And I so badly wanted to pop out of my bubble. And that was, the original name of my whole initiative was Pop the Bubble. I just said to myself, I have to make some sort of response to this. Whatever I'm doing now isn't enough. I need to shift. And at the time I was, we had a nonprofit consulting gig that we were doing for different nonprofits who work with youth. That was our focus. And I just decided, I need to shift from that. And the only thing I could think of to do was to get in a car and drive across the country and talk to as many people as I possibly could and try to get my sense of what was going on in this country. Why had we just elected Donald Trump? What was motivating? What I felt was quite a radical outcome for a US election. And it didn't really make a lot of sense. Like, it wasn't a rational thought to go driving across the country. I didn't know really what would come of it. I didn't know exactly who I would talk to. It was just one of those kind of leaps of faith that sometimes we take.
That's the beauty of pilgrimage generally, is that I think it's very seldom that pilgrimage is the rational answer or the rational response to something. Like, I'm going to hike 3,000 miles to the Camino de Santiago, or I'm going to hike across India, or I'm going to walk across South America from, Tierra del Fuego up to the Isthmus of Panama. Usually not the rational response, but it's a way of learning something that I personally think is almost impossible to learn any other way.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I was reading a book at the time. I don't know if you know who Charles Eisenstein is, but he wrote a book called The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And it was right in the midst of really having a lot of doubt about this initiative or this drive across the country. And one sentence that he wrote in his book was, when the rational isn't working, turn to the irrational. And it just That's not an exact quote, but that was the essence of it. And it just really spoke to me because I had no rational idea of how to respond. That didn't have it. So all I had was an irrational idea. So anyway, I credit him with giving me a little bit more courage. And then the other thing that led to me really doing it was the fact that I told so many people that I was going to do it.
Yeah.
I kind of painted myself into a corner. So I put the word out, and because we were connected to a lot of nonprofits through our work, a lot of people were able to set up conversations for us along the way. A lot of the conversations had happened serendipitously. And I say us because at one point I asked my son, who was 23 at the time and wasn't in school and wasn't working, and I said, would you like to come with me? And he just leapt at the chance. So the two of us got a chance to do this together. So that's what launched the whole thing. And the conversations that we had in that trip, they were interesting, they were respectful, they were productive. We had lots of conversations with people we didn't agree with. And well, I was struck by two things. One, that people do want to talk. And two, if we have the right skills, we actually can have very productive conversations. And we don't really need to be afraid of each other in having those conversations. But so many of us are afraid. I mean, that's why we call them difficult conversations, because they trigger fear. And so I wanted to develop a workshop that would help people get over the fear so that it wasn't so controlling, that allowed them to be present to the conversation, responsive, creative, and not have the conversation, devolve into name calling and whatever
Yeah.
else it is that we're afraid might happen.
So was the workshop developed in response to the conversations on the pilgrimage, or was it something you were offering?
The workshop came out of the road trip.
Okay. So then what was I mean, it's clear for me what the benefit was for you to go and meet these people from, out of your bubble, to pop your bubble and understand. How was it kind of sold to them? Like, why would people come to this?
Well, let's see. Sometimes they came because somebody organized a gathering. Maybe like there was a nonprofit I was connected to that had people in Texas. And so this one woman heard that I was coming, and so she gathered a group of people together, and so they came. So often it was at the invitation of somebody else. That's, I know this person, he's about to travel across the country. Would you be willing to meet with him?
Got it.
And
Yeah.
they would say, sure. Yeah. So usually people said yes. And then there were a number of conversations that were just serendipitous where, a real special one was being in Georgia on Martin Luther King Day it wasn't Montgomery. I always forget the name of the city, but it's where in 1962, there was a Baptist church there was a bomb that killed, I think it killed three children, three young girls. Yeah. And there was a ceremony there at a church kitty corner to that, at a park kitty corner to that church. And so the people there were nearly all African American, and we just struck up this one conversation with this one older gentleman. And it was just such a beautiful conversation about what was going on in the country, what he felt about what was going on in the country. He was definitely in his 60s, maybe even early 70s. He was a Vietnam War vet. And it turned out that his wife was in that church, I think it's the 16th Street Baptist Church. And she lost her eye in that bombing. So he had a very intimate connection, right, with that whole part of our history. And so to hear his reflections on, his response to what was going on in the country with regards to the election of Trump, it was just very soulful, very insightful. And so anyway, there were just conversations like that happened serendipitously that were really beautiful. And I think, I went away and wrote a blog post about it, and he and his wife were both so grateful that I had written a blog post, and they felt somehow that it just sort of validated them in a way, and validated their experience and validated their perspective. She sends me an email through Facebook afterwards just saying how much it meant to her that I had written it up.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of what's occurring to me in terms of answering that question.
Yeah, no, and it makes such sense that, I don't want to get too much into my impressions or opinions, but one of the things that I felt around the Trump election is that there's a lot of people that felt like their voice wasn't being heard. And I think, there's a lot of criticisms. But one thing that I maybe admire is that he was really into tune in to that need of these unheard voices and provide the empathy that people needed. And so that kind of that feels incredibly validating. And I think I can really relate to that. I think we all want that, whether it's in our domestic partnerships or in our communities or in the national setting. Like our experience, our voice, our suffering, actually, we want that to be heard and known, and for that to matter to someone else other than ourselves.
Yeah, no, I think that is for sure certainly a huge slice of it, for so many reasons that when you really start to explore it, right, really get to the what I think of as the sickness of our society. And by that I mean, well, I think in a simple way to say it, is that as a country, right, we've built an economy, we have not built a community. What an economy does is it develops very fragile relationships. It develops very transactional relationships. And it also, our sense of worth becomes tied to how am I doing in that economy?
Oh, yeah.
And so we have, identities that we've tried to define ourselves in terms of a mirage in a way, right? That an economic system is something that is core to our being, and it's not. And so I think this is really what creates, it's the fragility of the identity that creates the anti-immigrant, the racial biases, the fear, right? All of that starts to come into play. So the reason I bring this up is that I think, yes, people want to be heard, but there's something so much more fundamental than they want to be heard, is they want to be connected, right? They want to have authentic relationships with people. And I think that's what the US does not provide. It does not provide authentic relationships. And, related to this, I remember when I met with the liberals, at some point during the conversation, I would ask them, what did you do to contribute to this outcome, the election of Trump? And they were really stumped by the question. It was like, what do you mean? What did we do? We didn't vote for the guy.
Mm-hmm.
But then they would think about it a little bit more. And pretty much every time they came to the same conclusion, was that they were comfortable and they tuned out.
Mm.
They weren't paying attention to the people who were less fortunate to them, right? And so again, it comes back to that idea of relationship. We have fallen out of relationship with each other. And so, the focus of my project now, the Difficult Conversations Project, is to help people develop the motivation and the skills to want to build those relationships. Because I think without that, nothing else really is possible.
I mean, it's very challenging what you're saying. I'm just hearing it and feeling like overwhelmed, or maybe even like lack of belief that it's possible, because you're talking about a community, a nation of 300 million, or perhaps more people, whereas on the level of an individual community, like I live in this small town, I'm not friends with everybody, but I have a lot of friends, and I have a very strong community, and I have very strong connections, and I'm deeply in relationship with a wide array of people. And there's a whole bunch of people that I don't know at all. And I think other people, I don't go to a church, but many people do. And I think in churches, they can often be very successful at building these relationships with groups of 40 or 60 or 200 or some amount of people. But to do what you're saying, you're not talking about an agglomeration of millions of small communities. You're actually talking about like a nationwide community where we actually care about hundreds of millions of people that we've never met, who don't look like us, who share very little in the way of affinity. I mean, that to me requires an opening of the heart in a way that very few of us, myself included, are currently not capable of.
Well, I think that you're obviously not going to have close relationships with, as you say, 380 million people. But we could largely have a shared value around the building of community. I remember I was part of a nonprofit in the 80s. It was called Beyond War. And there was just a few agreements that you had as being part of Beyond War. One was to maintain an attitude of goodwill. One was to resolve conflict without violence. And one was to work together with others to build a world beyond war. And so to sort of symbolize that commitment, we had a little pin with an earth around it. And so when you travel, it got to be a pretty large organization. And so when you saw somebody with that pin, you automatically felt an affinity for that person because you knew you shared those values, right?
Yeah.
Those are beautiful values.
Yeah. I love that. Beautiful. So what's the analog for our country? Let's say the pin is the flag. We're gonna reinfuse the flag. We're gonna take it back from all of its pre-existing imperialistic and colonial connotations, and we're going to use this flag, and it's going to be the new pin that implies these like one or two or three or four really broad general commitments that we can all commit to. What are your candidates that you would submit for that?
I think the ones I just mentioned wouldn't be bad, right? To maintain a spirit of goodwill, to resolve conflict without violence, and to work together to build a country that is united for the common good. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, okay, let's get into it. So the first one was maintain an attitude of goodwill. That seems unassailable. I love that. hard to misinterpret that. Hard to be vague about what that means. Difficult to accomplish, even in our like familial relationships, but very clear when we're accomplishing it and when we're not, and we're always doing our best to maintain an attitude of goodwill. That's awesome. What was the second one?
I'll resolve conflict without violence.
Yeah. Again, that seems already, what's the word? Supported by our legal system, which is encouraging us to do that. At least it sets a bar for that. I think that most people would probably have no trouble being like, I commit to resolving conflict without violence. Mm-hmm. And the third one for me is it's great in that organization because everyone has this ideological commitment to a world beyond war, a world without war. But in a nation, that the way you said it was, what was it?
We will work together to, say, create a country that works for everyone.
Yeah, it just seems like there's so much room in that works for everyone to go in all kinds of different directions. And this is what I find so lovely about the profit motive, is that it's just clear. If the goal was to maximize GDP, not that that's a goal that I think is great, but what is great about it is that it's just very clear what that means, And if an oil spill counts as, increasing GDP, well then, fuck it, that's where we are, which is actually the case. But is there anything similarly clear that we could get, that we could just all, and maybe we don't need it. Maybe just the first two are enough.
Yeah, it could be the first two are enough. Yeah. It really could be.
Because we definitely don't have that right now, especially the first one.
Yeah. No, but there is, I don't know how you would articulate it, but there is something beautiful, right, in the concept of community, that there's a body, right, of to which I feel like I belong. And so maybe creating a country where everyone feels like they belong, and everyone can tell if they feel like they belong or don't belong. And when we meet people who feel like they don't belong, what is our service to people that feel like they don't belong? Anyway, but that's a tough one. But I do think just kind of, I'm just pondering it now that you bring it up, whether there is a third one.
I think it would really help the project if there were a third one, but it's going to be hard. But maybe that's an invitation to everyone listening to help us come up with a third one.
Yeah. Right.
All right. So let's go back a little bit to your journey. For you personally, what are ways in which you think you learned or you changed or gave up opinions or beliefs, or what are ways in which you transformed during that pilgrimage? Which I'm just insisting on calling it a pilgrimage instead of a road trip.
No, see, that works for me. Well, first of all, our ground rule was that we went into it just to listen. And so one thing I learned was the power of having a ground rule, because in a way we gave ourselves permission not to feel like we had to represent anything. We didn't have to represent a perspective. We didn't go to try to change anybody's mind. The goal simply was to learn. And what that taught me is that when you go in with that attitude, you can develop positive rapport with people pretty quickly, especially people on the other side, because that's an unusual experience for them.
Yeah.
So that was very powerful. So really just having faith in the power of dialogue was the main takeaway. Then the other takeaways that I had were one, that people, like I said, people did want to talk, but conservatives were concerned about being vilified and liberals were concerned about vilifying them. I can't tell you how many liberals said, I want to talk, but I'm just afraid that I'm just going to get so angry at them. So that's really why I went away to create a workshop, is how do we address that? How do we have these conversations and not be concerned that we're going to get so angry at them, but that we're actually going to be confident that we can engage them and have it be a good, productive dialogue.
So the converse wasn't a concern. The liberals weren't concerned about being vilified, and the conservatives weren't concerned about vilifying the liberals.
No, isn't that interesting? And then that's my experience. I don't think the liberals are too concerned about being vilified. I have not come across that. I don't know if you have.
I mean, as a person of color, I definitely am concerned, and other people, are concerned about violence and about racism and being rejected or discriminated based on that. I don't think that's not like a liberal conservative thing, but there's definitely, I think, other bases for concern of vilification in different ways.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. I was not thinking along racial lines, particularly ideological.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. And so then is your workshop aimed primarily at liberals?
Initially, yes, that was my idea, because I didn't think conservatives would actually be interested in it. And in truth, most of the people who come to the workshop are liberal. But when I have had conservatives in the group, they have also responded very, very positively. So that was really interesting to me. So I don't think of it anymore as it is for some particular subgroup. I think it's for everybody.
Yeah. All right. And maybe would you be willing to give us some of the key elements of it, or anything we might be able to, the people listening might be able to take home and practice, or just immediately have their lives totally transformed and infused with all the knowledge that you got from this pilgrimage in just a few minutes?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to have an awareness of what makes difficult conversations difficult, which is the fear factor. Either it's not going to go well, I'm going to get hurt in that conversation, somebody else is going to get hurt in that conversation, I won't be able to control myself, right? So to understand that when that happens, right, when we go into a conversation with fear, we've entered that conversation at an extreme disadvantage, because when you're fearful, we know from a neurological point of view, our higher capacities, right, of our neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, and self-knowing awareness, compassion, empathy, is it self-knowing awareness, even intuition, just kind of all the skills that we think of that make us human actually become lost to us, and we're reduced pretty much to fight, flee, or freeze, right?
Okay, that is so important. I think I just want to repeat it. So the key idea is that when we're afraid, all of these higher functions like awareness, empathy, intuition go out the window, morality, and we just don't have access to those higher functions in those moments.
Right.
And we can't change that, but all we can do is become aware as, oh, hey, I'm afraid right now, so I'm not going to have access to those modules of my consciousness. I'm a limited version of myself. And we can develop awareness of that.
Right. And even that, right, begins to change things. Just saying, being aware of it starts now to bring that is right there a function of our higher capacities, right? So you're starting to reactivate it simply by doing that. And then once you've done that, right, you've created that space. People talk about it as a space between stimulus and response. So you're starting to open up that space, and now you can bring in other tools, right? You can calm yourself down, maybe go take a walk, get into a better place, come back and re-engage. But just understanding that that's what's going on. And so with that as kind of my where I end that section in my workshop, I basically have a proposition that, fight, flee, and freeze are strategies for not getting eaten. They're hundreds of millions of years old, right? That instinct is hundreds of millions of years old. It's designed for immediate short-term threats to our survival. And we need strategies. We need different survival strategies today. We need strategies for threats that are long-term and that require cooperation.
Yeah.
So the three strategies that I talk about is the first one is to prioritize the relationship over being right. And that takes a lot of conversation, right? It's a lot of people start to have almost immediately some objections to that. And one reason, right, is that we are interested, or we are trained in a way to think in terms of polarities. And in a conversation, the polarity is, do I agree or do I disagree?
Mm-hmm.
And if I disagree with you, then I don't want to say anything, do anything that would in any way indicate or insinuate that I agree with you. And that
and listening is lumped into that category.
Absolutely. Even listening to you is a validation of your point of view.
That seems like a very dangerous idea to me.
Well, it seems like a very dangerous idea.
That listening to someone is a validation of their point of view. I mean, talking about, what we said earlier of our like two commandments of like goodwill and resolving conflict through nonviolence, it seems directly counter to that.
Right. So that's not where we want to be.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it does come out of thinking in terms of dualities and polarities. And we need to think in terms of relationship. Because usually in a difficult conversation, there's two centers of gravity. There's you and your opinion and me and my opinion. But by entering into a conversation, we've created a third entity, which is the relationship. It's not you, it's not me, it's us. And that shifts it. Right now, there's not a polarity, there's a unity. There is us. And if we really get a hold of that, then we start to realize that it is in our interest, it's in my interest, it's in your interest, it's our interest to make that relationship strong so that we can have the conversation we need to have. And that's why we prioritize the relationship over being right. It's if I insist on my way to the point where I am no longer willing to listen to you, then no dialogue can happen.
Yeah.
So the relationship, and another way to think about it, right, is a relationship is the conduit through which communication happens. And if the relationship is weak, right, then there's not much communication that can go through that channel.
Yeah.
Strong relationship has a wider channel. Now, the other thing that is important in that idea is the word relationship. You have to understand what is the relationship. Is it someone I'm married to? That's a particular kind of relationship. Is it someone I work with? Is it an abusive relationship? So prioritizing the relationship over being right, say in an abusive relationship, doesn't mean I subject myself to abuse. What it means is, what is the best thing that needs to be done to address a relationship that's abusive? Best for everybody, right? And I bring that up because that's kind of one of the objections people have, because they think somehow it means I have to be willing to subject myself to abuse in order to prioritize a relationship. No, what you're talking about is, what is the most positive, constructive thing I can do in this relationship? And it might be to extract yourself from it, right?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, there's this simplification of, all right, if I'm not just representing my opinion, then I'm just doing everything they want. And there's this kind of, again, this binary simplification. And you're saying, no, that you can synthesize and you can still listen, but then act appropriately for like the larger organism, for everyone involved.
Right. And the simple analogy would be, there's plants you can eat that are good for you, and there's plants you can eat that will kill you. So you have a relationship with both, but the nature of the relationship is different. So the way you approach them and deal with them is different. So that's the first one.
That's the first strategy. Yeah.
Right. Because it's an orientation to the engagement. It's the orientation we had on our road trip. We were there to listen and to understand. It was about the relationship. The second one is to see beyond your story.
Let me just go back to the first one with a little just something, an example. I go to the hardware store. There's a guy wearing a hat that triggers me or whatever. If I engage based on that hat, I'm not prioritizing the relationship. I'm just trying to be right. But the idea is that if I wanted to prioritize the relationship, I could still engage. It could still be on the subject of the hat, but my orientation would be very different. And I would maybe start with, like you did on your pilgrimage, focused on listening rather than reacting or insulting or saying the opposite of whatever was on the hat. Is that?
Yes. And to take it deeper,
Please.
it's so interesting to observe in ourselves. I certainly find this very true for myself. What I project on people who I don't know. All sorts of intentions and attitudes and whatever, right? Those that come out are coming out of me. So I own those because I don't know this person. I'm just assuming I see this hat and I have a whole gestalt around that person right now, right? You do, right? Just your whole body just is, oh, danger. You are not somebody who's out for my well-being, probably is, right? One of the assumptions.
Sure. Yeah.
So we have projections on people that come out of our own unconsciousness. Those fears, right? That they just pop out and we don't even know why. And just a really quick example. So I go to the gym and I was noticing myself that when teenagers come in and they start acting like teenagers, I react to them. They bug me. And I had all of these projections on them. And I thought to myself, now, I don't even know them. Why do I automatically think that they're just sort of arrogant, obnoxious, self-involved little cretins?
Wow.
Yeah, exactly, right? So when I thought about it, I said, oh, because I got picked on so much. So much. And I wasn't even aware that that's where it was coming from.
Wow.
Right? And I just kind of brought it in. And so that's what I mean. It's like we need to sort of own our unconscious projections on other people so that we are not mucking things up.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see that man with the Trump hat, you are also bringing forward past experiences that are influencing how you see this man. You're not seeing the man, you are seeing him through the filter of your experiences. Mm. And that's what it means to see beyond your stories, to start to be aware, to be aware of the unconscious content that we project on other people. And if we are that way, then what we'll do is we will not make all these assumptions. We will say he's wearing a Trump hat. That's all I know about him. I don't know why he's wearing it. I don't know if he's a big Trump supporter. I don't know if he just likes red. I don't know if the...
Yeah. It's a difference between the description of the actual event and the interpretation.
Yeah. Now you might be right, but you don't know yet. And so you have to start to have a conversation with them. And you maybe say, see his name, right? George, how you doing today? How's business going? You just start to connect in some way. Or you just decide this interaction is going to be as short as possible, I suppose. Those are options too. But a better option is to try to dispel whatever projection you have put upon him so that you move the relationship in a positive direction. And you come in every day and he has an experience of you. And if for any reason, he has a problem with, that you look like you come from India, over time, he's going to have a nice experience with somebody that he's never had it before, right? And he starts to change his thinking. So anyway, it's this idea of seeing beyond our story takes a lot of self-awareness. Mm-hmm. And the workshop is to help us begin to understand that we do see the world through our experiences. Our brain is literally shaped by our experiences, and our brain literally shapes how we see the world. So you've got experience to shape brain, brain shapes perception.
Yeah.
And when we know that, and then we know how constrained our perception is, and that we operate in the world with very little information. We operate in the world with the information our single life has experienced. And so if we know that, then we can say, wow, there's a lot I'm not seeing. And I just know that at any given time, there's a lot I'm not seeing. So I'm going to be attuned to when something happens that triggers me, because that's an indication of something I am blind to.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can kind of replace that pattern of reaction with curiosity. Like what am I missing in this moment? What am I blind to in this moment?
Right, right. And investigate it.
Yeah.
Investigate it. And I think if we could enter into every difficult conversation with the objective of what does this conversation have to teach me about who I am,
Yeah.
as well as who they are, right?
Yeah.
But it works both ways, both ways. That's why.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's like, I love that. It's like, how can I leverage this accidental interaction as a tool to become the person that I've been wanting to be anyways? How can I take advantage of every moment, every interaction, every conversation, everything I see, every piece of news as a tool to help me grow closer to my goals?
Wouldn't that be great? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because then the reward is greater freedom, greater positivity in our life, greater self-love. And I think, self-love and love of others, to me, it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
So then the third one, and these all three, right, it really go together. They need each other to be kind of a complete set.
Yeah. So, but the first leg of the tripod was prioritizing the relationship. The second is seeing beyond our own story. And you're going to give us the third.
Yeah. And so the third is to transform resistance into response. And the rationale for that is that resistance, I talk about it as an early warning system that we're about to get triggered. When we are in resistance, something is going on that is outside my story that I don't like. And so when we can become aware when resistance starts to kick in, when we are objecting to the way things are, then we can do that intervention more quickly. If we're not aware of the resistance and it just builds and builds and builds, then it tends to end up in an explosion, which that happens. And we can be creative with that when it does happen, if we're committed to self-reflection, but we do less harm if we catch it sooner. And so one of the steps in the process is, okay, I am in resistance, to ask the question, what am I attached to? What was the outcome that I wanted? Why did I want that outcome? And usually when we find out what the attachment was at a deep level, then we realize we can let it go. That it actually had nothing to do with the specifics of the issue that came up. It had to do with a deeper pattern, perhaps a deeper need to be recognized, a deeper need to want to be heard, right? To not be overlooked, to be considered, that is actually reflective of a lifelong pattern that began a long time ago. And so resistance can be that teacher to us, again, to become more aware.
Yeah. And like, once again, it's like seeing the moments, the events of our life as kind of passing symptoms or just passing events that are indicative of some deeper opportunities for growth.
Yeah.
Invitations, maybe.
Invitations. Yeah. Invitations for growth, and you can call it for wholeness, for freedom.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I know you probably end up sharing that a lot, so I appreciate you doing a resume of it in this.
No, I mean, it's always fun to do it because I never know how it's going to come out. So
yeah. And so you've developed that workshop at the end of your pilgrimage a couple of years ago, and you've been teaching it ever since.
Yeah, I did my first workshop summer of 2017.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I've been doing it for a while now. Yeah.
And so how How has it transformed you to be doing that for 5 years?
My wife says it's made me a better person.
That's a very good indicator.
I tell people, I said, if you really want to change yourself, develop a workshop and lead it a lot.
Yeah.
Because, you become more attuned to when you're not walking your talk, because you're talking your talk so much,
Yeah.
it becomes unavoidable, the hypocrisy, you can't miss it.
Yeah. So once again, you painted yourself into a corner. Like
Exactly.
you couldn't
Yeah,
avoid being a better person because you were just
that's
talking
right.
about it so much. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good corner.
Yeah. It's great. But it seems like you were just something you said in the beginning of this call indicated to me that you're probably in a pretty good place to begin with if your 23-year-old child voluntarily chose to spend months with you on a road trip. That, I mean,
Yeah,
that to me that's like very high. It seems like a very high honor. I only have a 5-year-old child, but that'd be a dream come true for me.
it really, everybody talks about that, and when we were on the road, one of the reasons people accepted the invitation was because they wanted to meet him.
Hmm.
Because they thought, what would make a 23-year-old want to be with his father? Yeah, on a road trip like that. But it was a real privilege for me. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And has he continued? Does he work with you these workshops, or is he on some other?
He's written some great pieces for my blog, but no, I mean, he's got his own life and his own interests now, and he and his brother actually own a house together and live in Portland, Oregon, and yeah, making their way. And we see them, and certainly we talk frequently, and yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, I got two questions, one personal
Sure.
and
Yeah.
one very grandiose. So personally, were there seeds or kind of foreshadowing of this event and this turn in your life? It seems like a pretty major life change to go on this pilgrimage, come back, not go back to what you were doing before, but dedicate yourself kind of selflessly to spreading this message, this message of like love and understanding and listening and prioritizing relationships. Were you already kind of disposed to that beforehand, or was this like a radical break?
No, I think the sort of thematically that's been part of my life for a long time. In the 80s, it was expressed in the Beyond War movement, and when there was one other agreement that we had there was four, not three. I forgot. One was, I will not preoccupy myself with an enemy.
With an enemy?
With an enemy, and I will not preoccupy myself with an enemy.
Wow.
So my interest has always been around healing relationships, resolving relationships, building community. And then subsequent to that, in the nonprofit world, it was very much the same. I was part of an organization that worked with college students, and that really was the underlying principle and ethos of the whole organization was, basically we're all in this together, and we would talk about it as love is the action. Then when that evolved into a consultancy with my partners, we brought that into our work with other nonprofits who are trying to build a culture, build a team among their volunteers and their staff. Those were sort of the operating principles too. And so it really was another application of the same. And what was different was just, yeah, how it manifested.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And so here's the grandiose question to send us out with a bang here. So 16 months ago, there was another presidential election, and this guy, Joe Biden, won. And he was not my candidate, but I was excited because he seemed like this, the kind of marketing around it was he's this guy that could really bring people together, compromise. And I just saw that everything you're talking about, the divisions, the relationships have been so like rent by the past few years that it just seemed good for there to be some healing. And I had all these like visions or imaginations of what this great mediator might do to bring us back together. I haven't followed it too closely, but I don't think he did that. If it were you and you had access to hundreds of millions of dollars and resources and a huge amount of civil servants and military and all these things to help bring our country back together, What would you design on like a national level? What kind of program would you offer us?
Yeah, I would have a program built around conversation, around bringing people together in communities to meet each other, to greet each other, to get to know each other. And if I were president, I would sit down with all of Trump's supporters and I would want to hear what you have to say. And I would encourage other people to do exactly the same. I'm kind of floored, actually, that there's, it's like we're dense, where we don't get it. And so we keep creating this, well, we keep creating Trump the enemy, which means those who support him, we're saying they are the enemy, right? We're not getting it at all. We're making liberals, they're making it worse and worse and worse by the way that they choose to engage with the reality of this movement, this group, right? I'm just going to call them a movement because they feel like a movement, right? The Trump movement. So rather than sort of beat up their guy, give them a reason to leave. In a way, you're trying to, it's probably like any strategy where if you think your child has gotten caught up in the wrong group, they need to have a reason to not be there. Give them a better vision. Show them that you're interested in them. Show them that's what you were saying earlier, that you care about their perspective. So anyway, it comes down to relationship building. So however you organize that needs to be the focus. And the thing is, everything about our society works against that. It's not in the interest of corporate America for Americans to have good relationships with each other. Because if we have good relationships with each other, we're going to buy less. And we're not going to be so susceptible to marketing campaigns and strategies that are designed to make us feel insecure. The shift that needs to happen is so huge and yet so simple. The economy in its place. It's not at the top and people at the bottom, right? Relationships first. And then you ask, what in our society needs to shift to be congruent with a decision to put relationships first? It would just be such a wonderful thing to do. And eventually we're going to do it or we just have, a lot of dark times ahead of us.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'll just summarize in case someone wants to implement this. There's a two-pronged approach. One is to get geographic communities together and encourage them to talk and maybe in a facilitated or mediated way to help people like understand the ground rules and get over all of these, fear-based processes that you've talked about. And so, scale that and then kind of a mandate from like the leadership of the country on down to all of the politicians who are willing to listen to go and spend time and talking to the people that did not vote for them, whatever side of the fence they're on, just to go and like connect and listen and hear and empathize with the people for whom they did not appeal. Thank you, Kern.
Well, Ankur, thank you.
I think this is so important, this conversation that you had with Kern. And I was just pointing out when we had our first conversation about, hey, what would it be like to do a podcast? And we were kind of like kicking content around. I was like, this topic, this polarity, this like incoherence in our conversation to me is like the most enthralling subject of our time. And it's just like on every day there's a new news item or some new hot take, some new hot button issue that just puts it like right every dinner party that I go to, there's like 3 or 4 factions on any, whether it's vaccine or the, I won't even go through the list, but you understand what I'm saying. Now, of course, the unfolding Ukraine situation. I'll just depart a little bit, but my partner is from the Ukraine.
Yes, I know that. I've been wanting to ask you about that. Yeah.
And and they have family living there. Without exposing too much of our family drama, my in-laws, her parents are aligned with Putin.
Yeah.
With Russian national. You know this already.
I mean, I didn't know that, but it's not surprising.
Right. Many Russians are.
Yeah.
My partner, of course, is educated here, University of Chicago, very like liberal humanist education and professional life. So her and her brother are quite different on this issue.
Yeah, from the parents.
Yeah, from the parents.
Yeah.
Now her cousin is this beautiful like folk artist, very sensitive poet, artist living in the Ukraine. And they just were able to get some type of a Skype call across with him. They're on total lockdown. And he just so much uncertainty, so much fear, so much angst, just such anxiety.
Yeah.
I mean, very few of us can really imagine what it's like to live through a conflict.
Yeah.
Military involvement. And somehow Elena finds herself on vacation right now at like Airbnb in a very tropical, luxurious situation. And the amount of just cognitive dissonance, just all the different facets of this experience for her. Like when I talked to her this morning, it was just like she didn't know where to land. She felt guilty for laying in this lawn chair while her cousins like huddled in some tenements in Kiev.
Yeah.
So, and then at the same time, like her having to navigate these conversations with her parents in a way that preserves their relationship and honors their relationship, and she has integrity with what she believes. And anyways, I've rambled enough. All to say that this listening to this conversation with Kern felt so timely to me. Felt so relevant and so needed.
That's what's amazing about it. It's perennial. It's always timely.
It's always the thing.
Because we're fractured.
Yeah.
And this thing with Ukraine is bringing it home to Elena because she has family there. But it is our essential reality in modern capitalism of there being huge amounts of like war and inequality and terror and sickness and disease while we're on vacation in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And we can be like more or less tuned into it. And this makes it like, oh, I cannot tune out from it. But this is what it means to be in the fucking 1% of the 10% of the whatever percent in the developed world where things are like pretty cool while there's just intense, war zones and rocket fires and just smuggling rings and drug cartels. And, it's just like all manner of terrible and nefarious stuff all the time in every country, not just the Slavic and African and South American ones, even here, right? But it's just we come with this confrontation of like, oh, I can't ignore that reality anymore. That's one level.
Gosh, it's several levels, I think, maybe even if we took a closer look at it. And it's interesting because it leads me into some questions I have for you and conversations I want to have with you about another guest you've interviewed, this Charlie.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up too because it's so connected.
It's so connected because then it's like the paralysis of guilt also, and the sort of impotence of, that was her point, is I'm just sitting here and it just feels like, reading Noam Chomsky and trying to make sense and just like all the kind of intellectual exploration of what's really happening, United States foreign policy, what's Putin really up to. She's like, feels like I have the luxury to kind of contemplate this thing from a distance. Meanwhile, my cousin is just like huddled in this apartment. So I guess the question there is then, with this privilege, is there any opportunity? Is there anything you can do? Because I think there's also this paralysis of sort of, I feel guilt. I don't really have any other outlet but to consume more. I can't ignore it. I have some friend that every time I see them is going to remind me about it. I can, kind of post about it online. I can yell at people. I can start arguments about it in the grocery store. But what are my real, just to say, like, put it in the Peter Singer context, what actual channels of agency do I have in situations like this other than to just make sense of a situation for myself and my close relationships? Or is that enough somehow?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where, let's think about it. That's where Kern and Charlie would have different answers. Not that they would not appreciate the answers the other give, but what we were highlighting in those interviews
Yeah.
is that Charlie, Life You Can Save, Peter Singer's organization, he's like standing up and holding this flag that like, there's actually a lot that we can contribute and it can go a really long way. And we don't need to have how do I phrase it? Each one of us is totally unable to solve the whole problem. And
Yeah.
that's why so many of us do nothing.
Right.
That's a problem. we can overcome that emotional experience, accept the fact that we can't solve the whole thing, and make the small contribution that we can make.
Mm-hmm.
And in Charlie's case, it's monetary. He's just like, we can just make a simple monetary contribution, and it will actually save people's lives, guaranteed. And with like quite a big bang for your buck when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one solution. And then what Kern is saying is, or here's me extrapolating from what he's saying, but that the seeds of these conflicts, these like large scale, I'm going to invade your country conflict, there's some relationship there to the conflicts that we're having in our country amongst this, what used to be like a national community, or maybe we all hoped it was, and maybe it never was. But now it's very clear that it's totally fractured, and every dinner party you go to is us versus them along 4 different axes. And there's a way out of that. And that way out is dialogue and listening. And Kern actually gives, and we didn't even get into this in the podcast, but he has dedicated his life to teaching workshops for free about how to get rid of those ideological blinders that we all have.
Yeah.
Or the kind of contamination of all of our experiences up to this moment that makes it so I can't really see you or hear you. I can only see my own.
Implicit bias.
Yeah.
I mean, he does mention the workshop.
Oh, good. Okay.
And my immediate thought was, I would love to take this.
Oh, yeah. I took it. That's how I met him. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I
I read about it and I was like, I missed some sort of free, I don't know, talk he was giving that was open to the public. So then I emailed him. I was like, hey, I want to take this workshop. I organized it in my hometown with like 8 people we knew. We all took it together and it was amazing. And I highly recommend it for you and for everyone who's listening to get deeper, into what Kern is doing. It's a tool that I wish we all learned in high school. And I think there's probably people right now who are committed to bringing that into high school. So I applaud them. But I didn't get it then.
It's while you were talking, this is maybe, I hope this isn't too tangential for you, but we've done some unpacking of integral theory throughout the season. Like you kind of did this quartet of this exploration, and it was almost like I felt like that quartet was actually modeling how we might use this approach actually in dialogue, in action.
Yeah, it's been a nice opening to this season.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like you said, I had originally framed it as a quartet. It started with Fighting Woman, and then it went to the Robert McNaughton, which was the integral theory guy.
Right.
And then it went to the Irish writer and poet, Moncon. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. To kind of balance the rationality of what Robert was doing. And then Kern, who is explicitly talking about having these conversations and finding not only common ground, but also synthesis. It's like, we can all learn from everybody. And even the people, like gun control, this like super divisive issue, like every side of that issue, there is a core truth, like a core value that we all believe in. There's like some sort of universal human need there. People's priorities are different. People's ways of talking about are different. Their ability to hear other perspectives are different. But rather than being like, oh, those fucking wackos, you can really be like, oh, like what can I integrate from that perspective? Like what am I missing? What is the opportunity for me to learn? That's where I want us all to go, is to every potentially emotionally reactive and triggering situation for me to be able to turn on the lens of, God, what can I learn from this? Like if we were able to do that, then we wouldn't get into those like arguments with our spouses. We wouldn't have those kind of, we would save so much time, you know?
Less fights in the grocery store.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, here's the hypothesis that I'd invite people to respond and tell me if you think this is right. Fewer invasions, fewer land wars in Asia.
All right. Well, I'm going to leave the audience with that to contemplate. I think that's a good button for this episode. And I invite you all to please do give us feedback. Do you think Ank's right about that? You can follow us on Twitter at 10KH Show. That's our Twitter handle. You can also comment in the comments below wherever you're listening to this podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. We really appreciate you going on these journeys. This is just as thrilling of a process for me. I feel like I really have a front row seat to a lot of these conversations. I'm grateful for that, Ank.
Yeah, me too. You're welcome. That concludes another episode of 10,000 Heroes. Your hosts were Ankur Shah Delight and Nathan Ramos. Special thanks to Pierre for the awesome episode artwork and to DJ Plainview for our theme music. If you like the show and you want to support our mission and our growth, here are 3 things you can do. 1, think of 3 people you know who would enjoy the episode you just listened to and tell them about it. Call them on the phone, send them a text, send them a link, whatever. But share your enthusiasm. 2, leave a glowing review on your podcast platform if they support it. Having lots and lots of glowing reviews is a great way for us to get found by other listeners. And 3, get in touch. Email us at info@10kh.show. Follow us on Twitter at 10khshow. Connect us with people you know who would be great guests. Give us constructive feedback, or just like in point 1 above, share your enthusiasm. Thank you and take care.